Hi, this video is looking at paper 2 questions 1 to 6 for the EDUQAS GCSE English Language. This video will be available as one big video looking at all questions, and I also will separate it down to question by question. This is the exam paper for November 2018. It was 2 extracts looking at a tightrope walk over Niagara Falls. So question 1 and question 3. So the reason I put these together is basically it's the same question but just looking at 2 different extracts. So question 1, it's basically just 3 questions, all worth 1 mark, and it's just to find the information question really. So you'll get asked 3 questions and you just got to find them in the text. So you should try to answer full sentences. You need specific details, and what you want to avoid in this question, even though it's only worth 1 mark, and you don't have to write a whole sentence really, please don't try and just write 1 word, because you've got to make sure you cover the answer. Time management for this question, after you read it, you should be looking to spend 3 marks, 3 minutes. Do it as quick as you can really, because you want to get on to the more questions worth more marks. So here we are, question 1 right at the top. And in this question, you're identifying the keywords and scanning through the text to find them. And it's basically, like I said, it's a search and find question, so it's testing your ability to find the information in the text. And you're going to be asked to look for explicit points, obvious bits, or you might be asked to find implicit points. So there might be a question where you have to maybe look underneath the obvious or look beyond the obvious, look more of a subtle question, but generally it will probably be explicit points. So like I say, use whole sentences to keep them brief. Do not copy out whole chunks of the sentences. If you write out a massive quote, 2 lines or something, the examiner might think you don't know what the answer is. So use as short as quote as you can for this question. Okay, a few tips I would say for this question, even though it's quite a simple question, a few tips. Read each question twice. Read with question in mind. Use a highlighter to pick out key evidence as you answer the question. And be specific, only highlight keywords and phrases. If you want to highlight, you don't have to highlight at all. Okay, many of the students failed to gain full marks in this question because they simply didn't read the question properly, so that's why you should read twice. Simple sentences. So for example, if you get a question maybe bullet pointing, okay, you would write something like, say this is about a man's appearance, you'd write he had wild eyes. Don't just put wild eyes because it might not answer the question. Okay, if you can't find one of the 1 mark questions, leave it. Don't spend 5 minutes looking for a 1 mark question because it's not worth it. Leave a gap and you can go back to it at the end of the exam if you have a spare minute. Okay, so question 1, for example, how far above the water was Wallander when he met his tightrope walk? We just got to find the information. So for example, 1A is there, 60 metres below, B is there, C is there. Oh no, these are all B. And then C is there. So like I say, there's no real trick question, you just got to find it. You're not talking about writer's techniques or anything, you just got to find the information. So on a couple of the questions there might be a couple of things you can put. As long as you answer the question, then it's fine. Okay, again, remember the tips we looked at earlier. So easy way to answer these questions. 60 metres. One thing that made it difficult for spectators, just put one thing. 500 metres away, the heavy mist, he was enveloped in the mist. And give name of one of the spectators, and there was 3 that you could have put: William Clements, Muriel Marshall, Bert Dandy. So any of those is absolutely fine. Okay, so question 3 is basically the same. The only difference is it's on the second extract, which is from the 19th century, but basically you are doing the same things. Generally question 3 might be a tiny bit harder than question 1, but it is asking for the same skills. Like I said, it's just in the 19th century as opposed to the 20th. Okay, don't get too stressed on the 19th century. It's the same as the 21st century one. Generally, EDUQAS pick one where you will probably recognise all the words, so it won't be too different from reading the 21st century one. Okay, there is the extract. 21st century one will also be longer. So this one here is probably only going to be about 3/4 or half a page of a picture. So yeah, it should be a bit easier to read. However, there might be the odd words you don't recognise. So again, then give one detail from the text, suggest Niagara is impressive, and then I've highlighted at the top a stupendous and inspiring place. Okay, so all of these could have answered A. This one answers B, and that one answers C. So we put them again in our Simple answers. Give one detail from the text, and I've given a few. Stupendous, one of the greatest objects in nature, 160 feet high, dizzy high. Any of those you could have had, it would have given you a mark. Remember, I'm not putting huge quotes. I'm not copying out a whole sentence or two sentences. I'm just picking out the quote that is very impressive. What was the size of the crowd? 25,000. Okay, how long did the performance last? About an hour. That's from the text. There you go. Pretty simple question, a pretty simple answer, and yeah, give yourself 3 or 4 minutes. Hopefully you get the 3 marks. Okay, question 2 is the language question. This is looking at the Tightrope Walk over Niagara Falls, paper 2. So the question is, how does the writer show that Nick Wallender's tightrope walk was astonishing and dramatic? You should comment on what he says, his use of language, and basically anything else that you pick up on that shows it was astonishing and dramatic. So in this question, you're looking to make 5 or 6 quotes. What are the marks given for? Clear points, clear explanations. What we want to avoid is waffling or big PE. So we prefer to look at quite a lot of quotes. So we prefer 6 or 7 small PEs as opposed to just 2 PEs that are huge. Okay, question 2 is that always going to be there in the exam. Okay, so it's a 10-mark question. So you're looking at 13 to 15 minutes and looking to make basically as many quotes as you can in that time. So terminology is not needed on every point. Leave it if you're not sure. A lot of people get obsessed with similes and adjectives and verbs and alliteration and statistics. Don't get obsessed with it. Maybe if you're doing 5 or 6 quotes, maybe on 1 or 2 of the quotes you can talk about it. But generally, you're going to get your marks for just explaining why the writer has used that language. So you need to use a range of quotes, like I say, from the beginning, middle and end of the extract. So what I mean by that is, if we're doing 7 or 8 quotes, we don't want them just like this, all from one part. It says in the examiner report 8 or 9 times they want coverage from all over the text. If we don't want it like this, we like it like this. So all over the text, to show the examiner you've read the start, middle and end of the extract. Try to write your answers from top to bottom. So what I mean by that is, if we go back to this, try to write your first PE on the first bit and your last PE on the last bit. Try to make it sense, chronological order. So in this question, you're analysing the writer's use of language and basically saying, what does analyse mean? Well, we're examining in detail, why has the writer decided to use that word? So we're going to comment on the effect of words and how they make the reader feel. So what emotions are the reader meant to get from the words that have been written? So let's look at an example question. How does the writer make the weather seem scary to the boy with the quote, "The rain thumped against the window"? So we're going to look at that quote and say, how does it meant to look scary to the boy? So we're looking where a writer deliberately uses words. So we're going to look at why the writer has chosen to use the verb thumped. Okay? So we're going to zoom in on the word thumped. Go back to this question. So the writer could have said, the rain tapped on the window, the rain touched the window, but the writer's purposely chosen to use that word thumped. If it did say the wreck tapped against his window, this is probably, that's what a tap is, isn't it? So it's nice and soft, no big deal, not aggressive. Yeah, it's a very sort of, very almost like quite a slow, quite a gentle thing a tap would be. But the writer hasn't chosen to do that. And if we're thinking about rain, this is the kind of tapping the gentle rain would maybe cause. But the writer's chosen that he hasn't used the word thumped, he's chosen the word thumped. So what does thumped mean? Let's analyse the word thumped. Why has the writer chosen? What image do we get? We get this sort of image with thumped, don't we? So completely opposite to the other one, we get an aggression, a violence to do with the word thumped. Yeah? Like again, power, aggression, violence, strength. And again, if the rain thumped, it'd probably be like this, or even harder than this rain. Probably would be even more extreme than this rain. So if we think of the word thumped, what do we think about? So we think about these things, but let's put that, those are the images. What words, what connotations does the word thumped have? So I would say the words that I would link to a thumped are power, aggression, anger, strength or strong, punishing, force. All I've done here is the bigger words are the ones that really associate to me, and the weaker ones are maybe the ones that I don't associate as much, but still have some sort of link to the word thumped. Okay, so we're looking for 3 things in this question. What does the writer say in the text? What method does he use? And what's the effect on the reader? So I would say a little An example sentence, this isn't particularly a great sentence, but it's a sentence maybe that you would use in the exam. It certainly would get you sort of grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. And very simply, the use of the verb thump suggests the storm seems strong, angry and punishing to the boy. Okay, so the word thumped is saying that's what the rain is doing. It's suggesting the rain has strength, that it's angry, that it's punishing. That's what's making the boy scared. Again, I don't have to use the word verb. If I didn't know that thumped was a verb, don't guess, because it won't look particularly great on your answer. If you're not sure what it is, just say the use of the word thumped. If you do know it's a verb, then definitely use it. Okay, so if we look at that in a bit more detail, that little sentence, I've got my point here, the verb thumped, I've got my quote, thumped, and I've got my explanation of why the quote makes it scary. Okay, so let's look back at the actual abstract and the exam. There's our question again. Go back to the start of the video if you want to see it again. What I would always do with an extract is, when I get my extract, I've already read it by now because I've done question 1. I would zoom in on the language. So what I mean by that is look at little words, 1 word or 2 word phrases, zoom in on the language and pick 5 to 8 quotes with a highlighter that make the tightrope walk seem astonishing, dramatic. Trying to pick out 5 to 8 quotes. Okay, so ones I would pick out would be to show that it's astonishing and dramatic, this tightrope walk. So no one else in the world had done it. He was the first person to walk across Niagara Falls on a tightrope for more than 500 years. The churning water, thundering falls. So think of why the word churning, why those adjectives churning and thundering have been used. He was perched precariously over the raging waters below. A crowd of over 125 people had packed to see the historic performance. It's a once in a lifetime event. He ignored the first rule of tightrope and looked straight ahead, and he looked down, and it's a daredevil act. So I would say those are the best quotes, but there's probably loads more that tell me it's astonishing and dramatic. So I'm going to now analyse and try to do as many of those quotes as I can in 13 to 15 minutes. Okay, and this is the structure that I would generally use. I probably use this structure for the first PE I'm going to do in my answer, and then after that, each time just maybe list the quote and then explain why it's been used. So in the text, the writer makes it astonishing and dramatic, because that's the question, by using the phrase, shove my quote in, and then put this suggest, and then explain why that quote has been used by the writer, explain why it is astonishing and dramatic. So the first ones I'm going to examine are churning waters and thundering falls. So I think I'm going to zoom in on the adjective thundering and explain why the writer's used it. Because the writer could have just put the churning water, the falls below, or the Niagara Falls, but he's chosen to use that word thundering. So what does thundering suggest? So I put in the text, the writer makes the walk astonishing and dramatic by using the phrase thundering falls. This suggests the falls are powerful, explosive and booming. This emphasises the danger Wallander is facing. Okay, so let's look into more detail. So my point is that the writer makes it astonishing and dramatic. I'm probably going to use that as sentence starter nearly every time I do a PE. Don't worry about sounding boring. It'll give a nice structure to your answers. By using the phrase thundering falls, that's my quote. And then my pink is my explanation and saying why is the quote being used and what are the connotations of the word. I put this suggests the falls are powerful, explosive and booming. This emphasises the danger. So there is my explanation of why the word or that phrase makes the walk seem astonishing and dramatic. Next one, a crowd of 125,000 people packed the roads. Okay, so what do we think about the word crowd? What does that suggest in our heads? 125,000 is a lot of people, and even the word packed suggests or people are almost crammed in. So my PE is, in the text, the writer, blah, 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 uses the phrase a crowd of over 125,000 people packed the roads. The huge amount of people waiting suggests it's going to be an amazing spectacle. Okay, so again, my point is also I forgot to say, if I wanted to add a bit more for that one, I've maybe talked about why the crowd and 125,000 people, I've talked about that. If I wanted to zoom into the word packed and say why that's been used, I could add another bit and say the verb packed suggests it's so busy people can barely move. But I wouldn't have to add that bit if I don't want to. First thing to note of this is, it does what it says on the tin, it explains the question, but also it's only 2 sentences. The major way people do not do well on this question is, instead of doing paragraphs or sentences like this, answers like this, maybe doing 7 or 8 of these, they tend to pick 2 quotes and they do these huge PEs, which we don't need to do. Doing 7 or 8 of these will really get you the high grades. Okay, so again, there's my point. There's my quote, and then I've basically explained why has the writer decided to use that statistic. Well, he's used it because he's trying to say that it's such an amazing thing that people crammed in to watch this person. If it would have said a crowd of over 10 people had gone to watch him, we're not really thinking it's particularly a great thing. But the fact that 125,000 people have gone suggests it's some kind of major event. Okay, so banned explanations in this question, this is where big massive thing where people go wrong, is instead of zooming into the quote, instead of doing the pink like we do here, explaining why, being specific, saying why are those one or two words, why are those being used, people who don't really know what they're doing tend to just go really general, and they would write something like blah 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 blah, here's my quote, and then they would say this makes the reader want to read on. This puts an image in the reader's mind. It makes it interesting for the reader. Okay, all of these will get you absolutely no mark, and the examiner will just give you a big fat 0. Okay, so you've got to just pick a word and say why is that word being used. These are all vague and could be made about any text. It's just a bit of a panic answer people do. So summary for this question: focus on what happens and how the language has been used. Maybe try to start at least with the sentence start the writer uses for your first PE. Try some correct subject terminology, but definitely not all the time, okay? It's better not to use it at all if you don't really know what you're doing. So I would say if you're doing 5 to 6 PEs, maybe talk about subject terminology maybe once or twice. It's more important to explain why the words have been used. Main thing is explain why you've picked the quote and what the words mean for the reader in the question. Use as many examples and quotes as possible in 30 minutes. So a lot of my students get worried about, oh, I haven't done my 5 or 6 quotes. Don't think about it in terms of, I haven't done my 6 quotes. Just do as many quotes as you can in that 30 minutes. When the 13 minutes is up, you go on to the next question. Okay, question 4, paper 2, Tightrope walking over Niagara Falls. This is the November 2018 reset. Okay, question 4. So this is how the questions sort of line up on all the exam. Yeah, we've got 2 find info questions, well 3 really. Then we've got an opinion question for question 4, which is the one we're looking at, the language question for paper question 2, and the last one we compare the 2 texts. Okay, question 4. Okay, the question is, in this extract, George Mank presents Blondin in a very positive way. How far do you agree? You should comment on what the writer says and how the writer says it. So here's our extract. It's the 19th century one, so it's a shorter one. It's only about half a page in a picture. Generally, it's a bit shorter than the other extract just because it's a little bit harder to read because obviously it was written in 1862, this one. However, you should recognise a lot of the words in here. Okay, don't get stressed, it's from the 19th century. A lot of students get worried, oh, it's from ages ago, I won't be able to read it. Just treat it just the same as the 21st century one. Like I say, there won't be many examples of vocabulary you won't know. Generally, you will know what they all mean. So key info about question 4, it will ask you to give your opinion. There's 10 marks available, so it's 13 to 15 minutes. Try to start each of your little PEs with I think, I feel, because that links back to the question. Use frequent, so use lots and lots of little quotes. Do not copy out any quotes that are more than 3 or 4 words. At the most, I like my students to zoom in on 1 or 2 word quotes. And consider how the text has had the impact on you as a reader, because the question is about what you think. Okay, so it's a 10-mark question, like I said, so it's 13 minutes, and we're going to try and do 5 to 8 quotes. However, don't get worried about that. My students get worried about that. I would say just do as many quotes as you can in 13 minutes. When 13 minutes is up, you move on. Okay, terminology is not needed on every point. Leave it if you're not sure. So if you're doing 6 or 7 quotes, maybe on 1 or 2 of the quotes use terminology. However, if you're not sure, it's better to leave it than use terminology like verbs and alliteration and get it wrong. So you need to use a range of quotes from the beginning, middle and end. So for example, if we're doing 7 or 8 quotes, we don't want them all like this. We prefer it like that. So it shows the examiner you've the beginning, middle and end of the extract. So key things to remember is asking for your views. Do you agree? So I will tell you this now. It's so much easier just to agree with any question. The examiner who do the exam papers, they won't pick something that you're going to disagree with. So I would say 99.9% you are going to agree with the views and explain why. Reference the question in your first line. So for example, I think that Banks presents Blondin in a positive way when, give a quote, so it links back to the question. Agree with the question, like I said. It's looking for content and method, so that basically means what the writer says and how he says it. It's actually very similar to question 2, which is the how question. For example, how does the writer make it interesting? The only difference is you're giving your opinion. Okay, so we're going to zoom in on keywords and think why has he used them. So I've used this example question on video 2 as well, but I've changed up the question a little bit so it applies to this one. So the question would be, the writer presents the boy as scared when he says the rain thumped against his window. How far do you agree with this view? So you can look at that quote and say, how far do you agree that the boy is presented as being scared? Remember, like I said, it's much easier to agree and say, yes, the boy is scared. So for example, if we said the rain tapped against the window, we feel like a little soft. No one's really going to get scared by something like that. A little kitten tapping on you. Yeah, a little tap like that's not going to scare anyone. However, if the rain thumped against the window and we look at the word thumped, what do we think of? We think about this when we think about thumped. So again, it's aggressive and violent compared to a tap. Yeah, it's violent. It's like someone's having a fight. So that it would be very, very hard rain. And the connotations we would have with thumped, the way the writers used it for a reason. So we think of the words power, aggression, anger, strong, strength, punishing, force. The writer has used the word thumped for a reason. They could have put hit, they could have put tapped, they could have put knocked. Thumped has been used to show the aggression and the power that the rain has had. So in this question then we're looking at what the writer says, what method does he use, and what's the effect on the reader. So if we look at this as an example point for that question, I agree the writer presents the boy as scared. The use of the verb thump suggests the storm seems angry, punishing to the boy. So if we look at it in a bit more detail, okay, point and link to the question. So I've said that I agree. I've answered the question already. I've said I agree that the writer presents the boy as scared. Then I've given my point with the quote. I've used the word verb to describe thump. Remember, if I don't know what a verb is, I'm not too sure about the verb, just say the use of the word thump. And I've put, how does it suggest the boy is scared? Well, the word suggests that the rain is strong and angry and punishing and almost would scare anyone. Okay, so here's the extract again. So I would zoom in on language. So I would always look at your extracts, look at the question, and try to pick 5 to 8 quotes that answer the question. So for example, in this way, pick 5 or 8 quotes that show Blondin is a very positive, that it was almost like a heroic figure. So the quote I would pick would be, the feat is a first, 25,000 people went to see him and they're eager to see him, so they're sort of like dying to see him. He stepped nimbly on the rope. Again, look at the word nimbly, it's been used. It could have just said he stepped onto the rope. The writer's chosen the adverb nimbly to suggest that the Blondin is almost like a hero, an athlete, or almost like a performer. We are told he's in full control of the situation. He sits complacently on the rope. We're shown here, he's brave because the rope is fragile. Again, they could have just said the rope, but they've chosen to describe the rope as fragile. He'd face certain death if he fell. Every eye watched him. This makes him seem inspirational to the crowd. He's described as miraculous, almost like a godlike figure. He seems barely tired. Even though he's done this amazing thing, he's barely tired by the end, and the crowd held their breath. Okay, so here's the question again, and this is the PE sort of structure I would use. So I agree that Banks presents Blondin in a positive light. Okay, that's linking back to my question. The question is, George presents Blondin in a very positive way. Do you agree? So straight away I'm saying, yes, I agree, presents. Then I've put, because the writer says, put my quote in. Then I'm going to put my, basically say why I've chosen that quote and why it shows him to be positive. So the first quote I'm going to look at is miraculous antics, as shown in this image here. So why is that word, or why has that phrase been used? So I agree that Banks presents Blondin in a positive light because the writer says miraculous antics. This suggests to the reader his feat was almost superhuman and godlike. So I've zoomed in on the word or the adjective miraculous, and I've said, why has that been used? Well, people, if it's a miracle, it's almost like it's an amazing thing that can't happen by like the science in the world. It's almost like something that a superhero, almost like a god or Jesus, something that you would do. So they're comparing him to that sort of level. So there's my point, there's my quote, and then there's me saying why I've chosen that quote and what it means. So the next one I'm going to look at is the feat is a first. So I agree that Banks presents Blondin in a positive light because the writer says the feat was the first. This suggests he's an innovative record breaker who's doing something no one else has ever done. So really simply, if it's the first time someone's done it, it's the first time someone's done it. He's basically doing something that no one has ever done before. Okay, point, quote, explanation. Okay, every eye watched him. Okay, so we're going to zoom into this quote and say, why has that been used? They could have just said people watched him. I've put, I agree that Banks presents Blondin in a positive light because the writer says every eye watched him. This suggests the crowd was transfixed. So the fact that every single person in the crowd was looking at him suggests what he's doing is amazing. So transfixed. And then I zoomed in a little bit further by saying, zooming in onto the adjective every, because it could have just said people were watching him or the eyes were watching him, but they've put every eye watched him. So the adjective every emphasises how in awe they were, that every single person was looking at him. Again, point, quote, explanation. Okay, next one. Greeted with large cheers. I agree that Banks presents Blondin in a positive light because the writer says he was greeted with large cheers. This suggests the spectators were very impressed by his antics. So really simple on that one. Again, point, quote, explanation. And what I do here, where in the pink, where people zoom in on the quote and say why it's been used, where you're going to get a not particularly good grade is by putting things like this. It makes the reader want to read on. It puts an image in the reader's mind. It makes it interesting for the reader. Okay, all of these are not going to get you any marks because they're not analysing the language. They're just saying something vague that could be about any text. So key information for question 4, your opinion, 10 marks. Try and use I think, I feel, or I agree at the start. Use frequent short quotes and consider how the text has been used. But remember, the main thing is agree with the question and say why the quote's been used. Okay, question 5, this is paper 2 of the Tightrope Walking Across Niagara Falls. This is the first question where we are looking at both texts. So question 5 is the penultimate question, one before the end. It's only worth 4 marks. Okay, but answer the question, be specific. So you're not comparing the text, you're not talking about the text in general, you're just doing what the question is. So this question says, using information, explain briefly how the spectators reacted to Blondin and Wallander. So all you're being specific on is you're looking at how the spectators, how the crowd react. You're not looking at anything else, you're just going to get you 4 marks from that question. So key info about question 5, you're looking at both texts, 4 marks available, 4 minutes. Key part is you're not comparing in this question. You don't have to compare. So for example, you don't say in text A blah blah blah, however in text B it doesn't. Or you're not saying in comparison, in contrast, however, whereas. You're not doing any of that. You're doing that on question 6. This is question 4, and it's basically the same as questions 1 and 3, and I'll explain a bit that. And so here are both texts, I'll explain about that in a sec. So basically, question 1 and 3 is exactly the same as question 5. The only difference is you're doing it on both texts. So you're just finding information. So you're just finding the information from the text, plucking it out and writing your answer. In this question, you don't have to do blah, 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 blah. This suggests the writer is doing this. All you're doing is picking out information. Time manage, so it's 4 minutes, or at the most 5 minutes. I would say 4 minutes, do it as quick as you can. Okay, on this question, terminology is not needed, so just relax and chill with it. We don't need to be talking about verbs and adjectives. It's not that kind of question, so just write down your answer. Don't worry about alliteration or anything like that. So here's the structure I would use. In the text by Burnett, it says, answer the question, leave a line. In the text by Banks, it says, leave a line. Again, you're not putting however, you're not putting contrast or anything like that. So here it is then. In the text by Banks, it says the crowds were eager and expectant. They were also curious, gave encouragement, and many wanted to shake his hand. Finally, they cheered, held their breath, and some fainted. So all I've done is looked at extract 1. The question is about how the spectators reacted. So that's all I'm looking at is how the spectators. Any time the spectators were mentioned, I've put it in there. I've actually probably done double what I need to do, really, but I've just put in as many quotes as possible. Then I've put in the text by Burnett, it said the spectators erupted with cheers, took photos. Finally, the crowds had come early and waited for hours to see Wallander. So I've put in as many quotes as I can. If I was struggling with time, I probably would only have done half as much I've done here, but I've got a bit of time, so I've done it all. Remember, it's only 4 marks. I'm not saying however or whereas or in contrast. I'm just writing down, basically finding the information from the question and putting it into a little paragraph like this. So key info for question 5, requires information for both texts, 4 marks for 4 or 5 minutes, and don't compare in the question. Just as quick as you can, get the information you need and get on to question 6. Okay, the last question on paper 2, this is Tightrope Walking Over Niagara Falls. This is the second question where you're looking at both texts, but the first question, the first and only question in the exam where you're comparing and contrasting the extracts. Key info for question 6, you need to compare the text, maybe say what's the same and what's the difference. PE sentences, use comparing words or adverbials like however, in contrast, likewise, in comparison, things like that. 10 marks available, so 13 to 15 minutes. On average, students do the worst. This is the worst one they do on the reading exam, mainly, not because it's a particularly hard question, but mainly because it's just the last question and people run out of time. So you need to give yourself at least 13 minutes to do this question. So the question will look like this. Both the texts are about tightrope walkers across Niagara Falls. Compare what Blondin and Wallander did on the crossings of Niagara Falls, and then how the writers convey or show the dangers of crossing Niagara Falls. So It's a 10-mark question. So basically the first bullet point means what the writers say about the crossings, and the second point, how one's saying how they say it. So do they use adjectives, the structure, punctuation, things like that. If you're struggling for time, just do the first bullet point. Yeah, so I would say if you get to this question in the exam, you've only got 5 minutes instead of maybe your 13 to 15 minutes. What I would do is I would just answer this question. Maybe find 5 or 6 quotes saying what they both said about the crossings, and don't really talk about the writer's technique. If we have the time, do it. But I would say it's better than to do as many quotes as you can on the first bullet point than maybe just do one bullet point on each, and one PE on both. So if you're really struggling for time, then do that. Okay, just find 2 or 3 quotes from each and say if they're the same or the difference. Obviously, if you've got the whole time, we want you to do both bullet points, but you could probably get at least 4 or 5 marks out of 10 just by doing the first bullet point. Be clear which text you're talking about. So easy way of doing this would be use the writer's names. If you're not clear and it's not obvious to the examiner who's marking it which text you're talking about, you're going to get a 0 out of 10. Okay, so you must be clear and use the writer's names. You've already read both of these texts in the exam by the time you get to question 6, so you're going to be familiar with them. So hopefully it's skimming it as opposed to reading the whole thing again. And don't worry if you feel like you might be repeating points you've already written in past questions. So this question is about what they did on the Niagara Falls. If you've already in question 2, for example, analysed a quote about what they did, don't worry about it. You can write it again, make your similar point in this answer as long as it's relevant. Okay, so what's the same, what's the differences, how can we make sure to the examiner we make it clear? So for example, we're going to try and use these words: same, likewise, similarly, also, to, as well as, different, but, however, whereas, on the other hand. I would say don't worry about using loads of different ones. I would say almost make your mind up before you go into the exam. What word are you going to use for same? What word are you going to use for different? So for example, I would use likewise if I'm going to say something's got something in common, and I'd say however if I was talking about them, maybe talking about a difference. So not a big deal, but certainly don't waste time trying to use different things to make you sound clever. Just use one from each and make it nice and clear. How many points do you need to use? I would say you're trying to use 5 or 6 quotes, as many as you can. Again, don't worry about thinking to yourself, I must use 5 quotes, I must use 5 quotes. Just try and use as many quotes as you can in your time, say 13 to 15 minutes. Okay, so for this question, like I'll do any other question, look at the question and try to highlight what the question's asking you. So in this case, it's asking what they did during the crossings. So I would look at both texts and highlight 5 or 6 quotes. Remember, not huge quotes, not 2 sentences, 1 or 2 phrases, 1 or 2 word phrases, highlight what they did during the crossings. This is how I would structure my PEs. I put both writers, okay, so or both writers agree or both writers disagree. Then I would say what Banks says, likewise or rather, because I'm comparing, and then Burnett says. Okay, so again, if we go back to the question, bullet point 1 is saying what the writers say about it, and number 2 is how they say it. So let's look at a number 1 example PE. So we're going to look at the one, just the first bullet point, which is what Blondin and Nick Wallander did during the crossings of Niagara Falls. So I'm going to do one PE just on what they did. Both writers showboated. So my point is that both writers said that the people showboated, that both of them, when they were on the tightrope, performed a little bit when they're on the rope. So that's what I've said. So I said both have said that. I've put blank says Blondin got to the centre of rope and sat down on it. Then I've put likewise. Burnett says Wallander knelt down and waved at the spectators. Remember, this bullet point is just about what they did. I'm not going to really examine the quote. So I've just basically said, made a point and written both quotes to back it up. So here it is all as one. So both writers, I put here, so both writers. So remember, I'm talking about both extracts. Then I've put the extract 1 quote, that he sat down on it. Then I've put extract 2 quote, yeah, to prove it. And I've put likewise, however. So basically put both writers showboated, and I've given a quote from each to prove that he did showboat. Okay, so let's look at the second. Remember on this said, remember what I said was, if you are struggling for time, just do it like this. Okay, so just worry about the first bullet point, what they did. If you haven't got time, just do 5 or 6 of these as opposed to doing the second bullet point. Okay, so but we look at a second point PE, how the writers conveyed the danger. So this one's a bit more looking at writer's technique. So how the writers tried to show the dangers. So I've put, both writers used emotive adjectives to describe the dangers the men faced. That's the point, that they used adjectives to describe the dangers. I put, Bank uses the word fragile, where the adjective suggests the rope is weak and could break at any moment. So I've zoomed in on the word fragile and looked at the connotations. It's weak, it might give at any moment. Then I put likewise. Again, I'm using that word to show if it's same or different in my answer. So likewise, Burn, it describes the water as churning, and then I've zoomed into the word churning. This suggests the falls are violent and powerful. So they both showed the dangers by using their choice of adjectives. And there you go. Again, both writers, extract 1, quote and explanation, extract 2, quote and explanation, and I've used my likewise, however, to show if it's the same or the difference. So remember, key info for question 6M, you need to compare the texts. PE sentences, try and use comparing words, 10 marks for 13 to 15 minutes. If you want to look at the exam paper, go to this website and download it. I'm sure you can find it on Google as well if you type in November 2018 paper. Okay, and good luck with your exams. Hopefully this has been some help to you. Feel free to leave a comment in the comment section.